Greetings from London. I'm here to join you in today's discussion of Culture Jamming 2.0. My presentation is the part of a larger project exploring possibilities and limitations of culture jamming protest in a cynical authoritarian state. More specifically, the present discussion focuses on the protest rhetoric of the self-proclaimed militant punk feminist street band Pussy Riot. I'm going to argue that Pussy Riot has not been able to playfully reappropriate Putin's tragic national brand and mobilize the Russian public. My discussion is based on a close textual reading of the rhetoric surrounding Pussy Riot's performances, with a special attention given to the punk prayer and the subsequent trial of the 3 Pussy Riot members. Just to remind everyone, Pussy Riot gave its most resonant and controversial performance in Moscow's Cathedral of Christ the Savior on February 21, 2012. A group of 5 Pussy Riot performers entered the church, changed into the band's signature colorful dresses and neon balaclavas, and jumped over a rail onto the pulpit. Then they immediately started singing without music, jumping, kneeling, and crossing themselves. The whole performance lasted about 30 to 50 seconds before it was intercepted by the church security. And here is a short video of this performance. A music video titled "Virgin Mary, Mother of God, Drive Putin Away" surfaced on YouTube shortly after the punk prayer. A soundtrack was added and the video was edited in such a way so that the whole thing looked like an organic performance. And here are several seconds of this video.
Глава КГБ из главных седой ведет протестующих на запад конвой, чтобы святейшего не оскорбить. Женщина может рожать и любить. Срань, 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 Господня, срань, 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 Господня, срань, 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 Господня, срань, 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 Господня.
The video allegedly became a reason for 3 Pussy Riot members' arrest. Nadezhda Tolokonnikova, Maria Alyokhina, and Evgenia Samutsevich were taken into custody 2 weeks after the performance and were held there until the trial began on July 30, 2012. Tolokonnikova and Alyokhina were sentenced to 2 years in prison for hooliganism driven by religious hatred. Samutsevich was released on parole since her participation in the punk prayer was found to be minimal. Instead of uniting the Russian public against the creeping authoritarianism of Putin, the punk prayer radically alienated many Russians. Those Russians who paid attention to the Pussy Riot trial or otherwise heard about the punk prayer divided almost in half into Pussy Riot supporters and opponents. Among the former are mostly atheists and educated people under 45, while the latter are represented by religious people and the elderly. Conservative Russians saw the punk prayer as an anti-Russian, pro-Western action directed against Russian orthodoxy and by extension everything Russian. Before I explain my argument in more detail, I must first briefly address the theoretical foundation of the present study. It is a blended Lacanian-Burkean theory of national identity construction. Simply put, Lacan's theory of the subject is built on the principle that there is lag in the center of any identity. This lag arises from the fact that the subject and its social world are constructed rhetorically. While a pure Lacanian reading of national identity renegotiation may not be especially helpful, I supplement Lacan's theory, more specifically Lacan's fantasy, the notion of one's vision of the national self and the national other, with Burke's concept of a frame as an attitude to life. Building upon Burke's classification of frames, I differentiate between comic and tragic national fantasy frames. In the tragic fantasy frame, the lack of identity is understood as loss and compensated by hating the national other who supposedly stole something that makes the national self whole and perfect. When a comic fantasy frame is adopted, one does not view the national other as the enemy who needs to be symbolically or physically sacrificed, but as a reminder that national identity is always imperfect or lacking. Burke's comedy approximates what Lacan saw to be the ethical goal of psychoanalysis, which is also the ethical goal of culture jamming protest. Unlike the serious, comically guided protest, culture jamming is a playful performance. Culture jammers rely on humorous fantasy frames such as satire, comedy proper, the burlesque, and the grotesque. In modern Russia, playful culture jamming can be more effective than serious protest. A successful culture jamming performance is obscure enough to be seen as harmful by the state, rejected by state supporters, and dismissed by apathetic, politically passive Russians tired of political turmoil in Russia. As Pussy Riot explains, the punk prayer was an ironic, funny, but also desperate action. It was a heartfelt political cry, but in a totally ironic, funny way. To counter the ridiculous farce of Putin's democracy, the Russian punk feminists arranged to coincide the punk prayer with Maslenitsa, a traditional Christian Orthodox festival marking the start of Lent, a time of buffoonery. Implicitly referring to Mikhail Bakhtin's subversive and liberating carnivalesque, Pussy Riot members stress that they are buffoons, maybe even holy fools who mean no harm. Indeed, the grotesque imagery of Pussy Riot's punk prayer was in tune with a carnivalesque spirit of Maslenitsa. Bright balaclavas were reminiscent of buffoon hats, the punk chanting, exaggerated genuflecting, and crossing challenged the order of a proper religious service. The grotesque is a precarious resistance tactic. It can easily shift from laughter to aversion. Though conceived as a playful and comically driven performance, the punk prayer failed to provoke self-reflective, welcoming laughter. Instead, it turned into off-putting absurdity. It happened due to the extreme directness of Pussy Riot protest, more specifically the choice of the performance space and specificity of Pussy Riot's demands. The very selection of the performance venue functioned as a narrative on its own. Being an Orthodox Christian is a part of Russian national identity. While Pussy Riot intended to attack the allegedly ungodly religious institution and Putin's authoritarian power, many Orthodox Christians saw the performance to vandalize their national fantasy. Besides, the choice of the performance venue afforded both the church and the state with an excellent opportunity to deafen the voice of the protest. At the instigation of Patriarch Kirill and encouraged by the state, the outraged Russian Orthodox public insisted on the criminal prosecution of Pussy Riot. The performance was perceived as blasphemous, and the performers as the enemies of the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russians. In addition to what the Russian punk feminists admitted was the ethically problematic choice of the performance venue, the specificity of the protest message has not been helpful either. Pussy Riot asked divine power to rid Russia of the country's biggest villain, Putin, and his lackey, Patriarch Kirill. While the Russians are worried by the questionable rapprochement of the Russian state and the church, the anti-Putin protest message did not find many supporters. The majority of Russians support and pin hope on Putin, but primarily in the absence of any alternatives. The punk prayer also touched upon the problems of freedom of speech, corruption on many levels, gender and sexual orientation discrimination. However, those issues, except perhaps the problem of corruption, are quite unpopular in Russia, and that also handicapped the subversive potential of the performance. While challenging the dangerous oppressive national image promoted by the Kremlin, the Russian punk feminists did not take into account the following. The goal of a true comic protest is not to reshape the dominant national image into yet another, however healthier, vision of the nation. It's true that people cannot live but within a fantasy, and those fantasies can range from healthier comic to more dangerous, tragic ones. However, the goal of protest comedy is to strip a tragic national vision of any meaning, thus showing it for what it is, nothing other than identity lack and perpetual desire to recover this lack by any means possible. The prayer was built on an ambiguous, coherent national narrative offered in exchange for Putin's tragic version of Russianness. Pussy Riot simply offered an alternative national story based on supposedly true Western values. In light of the catastrophic liberal reforms of the 90s in Russia and the long-standing paranoid suspicion of the West, Pussy Riot's vision of Russia is certainly less appealing to many Russians than Putin's Russian democracy. Putin's vision of Russian national identity is filled with sentiments of Russian imperial messianism and preference for traditional Russian ways. A coherent story underlying Pussy Riot's national fantasy is a feature of tragic rather than comic rhetoric. In addition, it's incompatible with playful ambiguousness of a culture-jamming prank. Instead of presenting others with a straightforward narrative, which backfired in contemporary Russia, the culture jammers should have aimed to inspire the Russians to build their visions of the national self and the national other in more responsible, comic ways. Pussy Riot should have relied on the comically driven burlesque. The burlesque is the fantasy frame of radical ambiguity. It is a more suitable protest tactic to counter a cynical authoritarian state. It verges to what Lacan calls symbolic stupidity and invites a wide range of unexpected interpretation and reactions. By relying on the burlesque, the protester maintains a delicate balance between a protest message obscure enough to seem harmful to the state on the one hand, and a protest message sufficiently suggestive to initiate a renegotiation of a tragic national narrative on the other. How exactly Pussy Riot could have staged its burlesque performance is perhaps a topic for another conversation, and more importantly, something for culture jammers to explore and experiment in. Thank you.